Hello, welcome back. This is episode 24, I think, of the Alfology2 podcast. So hello and welcome to you. Last week was a bit of a sort of full-on episode about whether or not the truth is something which realistically and actually exists. And as part of that episode, I sort of wrote this one at the same time. I wanted to mention what I'm talking about this episode last week, but I didn't manage to because I was a bit sort of short on time. I had lots to talk about last week. So I've sort of split it into two and I've written another episode on this week. So during the time that I was writing about whether or not the truth exists, I also got into a bit of debate with myself as to whether things can actually be good or bad, or what does good and bad mean. In the same way that sort of what does true and untrue mean. It's, what does good and what does bad mean? It's a similar sort of concept, but obviously it sort of feeds into a different, moral argument. So I've sort of done that episode this week. I had an episode, what is good, what is bad, what's the difference in good and bad, and do good things and bad things actually exist? So you might note some similar themes to last week's episode, and that's because they are along similar lines, but they aren't the same. So that's what we're doing. Look, we will go with it, and we'll see where we end up. So largely, sort of all things are considered to be either good or bad, and you might consider something to be good. Someone else might consider something to be bad. Most people might consider some things to be good. You everything pretty much has good or bad assigned to it by someone or everyone. That's essentially what happens with good and bad. And there's sort of limited scope for right and wrong, and that's what I'm going to talk about this week. So a good example of things that are both good and bad at the same time are things like public figures. So famous people, celebrities, not necessarily celebrities, famous people, notable people. They, almost all of them, have a good and bad element to them. And that can be in a number of different ways. So you've got people like political leaders would almost have good and bad. All of them. Because political leaders, you might be a fan of a political leader because he did something that was sort of, that you believe to be beneficial. But then somebody else might believe that something they did which was non-beneficial was bad. So almost all political leaders are good and bad. And that's where we get into real problems with politics, because you might say, the example I got written down here is like Tony Blair. You might say Tony Blair is bad. And if it was me, I would say Tony Blair is bad. But someone else might say, no, Tony Blair is good. I like Tony Blair. Tony Blair is good. And the truth is that Tony Blair is probably a bit good and a bit bad. So bad, war crimes in Iraq. That was quite bad. Good, education reform. So, some things he did were good, some things were bad. And it turns out, I don't believe that any political leader could do all good or do all bad. The consequences of almost any decision in the real world are some good and some bad, I think. I mean, you got people like Hitler, on the other hand. It's widely accepted that Hitler was a pretty bad dude. In the grand scheme of things, Hitler's not a great guy. But his early economic policies got Germany out of some serious shit. It put an end to their hyperinflation and, got people bread and water, which, if you're one of those people who got bread and water from Hitler, you might think he's a pretty decent guy. So even Hitler, he has a debate on whether he's good or bad. I mean, it's not that strong a debate because I think most people can agree that Hitler was pretty fucking bad. But, and that's an example of a public figure who is bad, but there are still people who might argue that he is good. And same with musicians. As I say, with any action, there's probably a negative and a positive consequence in the real world. And that's musicians are a big example of this. So Coldplay have written some absolute tunes. They really have really good stuff from Coldplay, a lot of it. But some of it is fucking garbage. I don't know if you've listened to Coldplay's albums. What they tend to do is write 2 really good songs per album, and then the rest is just fucking dreadful. So Coldplay, good and bad. But, someone might say to you, Coldplay are good. And I might say, no, most of their songs are bad. But they would say, yeah, but some of their songs are bangers. So, it depends what you consider for them. Sportsmen are the same. Like Steven Gerrard is a great footballer, was one of the greatest footballers of his generation. But he lost his team a league title by slipping over one time. So he's also bad. So as you can see, like with people, pretty much every person is good and bad, which is why when you get like serial killers and people who do like really bad stuff, we often just write them off as being bad. But the truth is that particularly like serial killers, you often get the whole, oh, I never saw it coming. He was such a nice, quiet boy at school. You always get that with these really horrible people. And I was listening to Louis Theroux at Literature Festival the other week talking about this. And he sort of said, and I agree with him, you can't separate sort of bad people from the rest of us, because bad people use the techniques of good people to do their bad things. So like Ted Bundy was really charming and all the women loved him. Really charming. You would never believe that he was going to do any horrible things to you. But it turns out that he was bad. And so he showed these good characteristics to make people believe that he wasn't bad. So with people, really, you've got to consider that almost everybody has a bit of both. I mean, not everyone's a serial killer, obviously. Obviously, mathematically, everybody couldn't be a serial killer, because if everyone's killed more than one person, everybody would be dead. Anyway, that's not the point. Yeah, people are, we're complex, so we're up and down. And look, it all depends on your perspective, really. So as I said earlier, that some people would consider one action to be good, some people would consider one action to be bad. So it depends on your opinion as well, which doesn't really help. So, and also your position, which would influence your perspective. So if, like me, for example, I own an iPhone. I have an iPhone, that's my choice of phone. And I would say my iPhone is good, a positive thing. My iPhone is good. But if, you're the person who lives in the third world, if you're the Chinese kid who suffered to make my iPhone, then the chances are you might consider my iPhone to be bad. And it just depends on your perspective. And that's a very sort of high and mighty privileged position to be talking from on that particular issue. But something which you consider to be really good, like a really good piece of technology, the chances are that someone has suffered for it on the way. So, at the same time, it's a bad thing. If you go to like really macro levels, you've got like life-threatening diseases, almost everyone would say, yeah, life-threatening diseases, that's a bad thing. But it's probably quite good for like the planet and the environment if we were to all die of deadly diseases, or if there were fewer of us because we all die. So diseases, probably a good thing depending on your perspective. If you're a tree, people dying of disease is a good thing. If you're a person, not such a good thing. On this whole argument of good and bad, there's also like a cool thing like the best versus the worst, and how that like if something isn't the best, a lot of people might say it's the worst, but that's not true. You get lots of things that are in between, and everything obviously is in between the best and the worst. So saying something isn't the best doesn't mean you're saying it's bad. Do you know what I mean? Like, if I was to say that I make the best cup of coffee in the world, and someone goes, no, you don't, that doesn't mean they're saying I make the worst cup of coffee in the world, or even a bad cup of coffee at all. They might say, your coffee is amazing. You make amazing coffee, but it's not quite as good as other coffee I've had. There's nothing to be offended by, and it also doesn't make it not true. So a lot of people like to use it's the best ever all the time. It's the best. It's better than everything. And like an example of this, you might say Queen are the best band of all time, and someone else might say Queen are the worst band of all time. the chances are that both of those things are wrong, and that Queen are not the best band of all time, and but neither are they the worst. And a lot of people confuse telling someone that something isn't the best for telling them that it's the worst, if that makes any sort of sense at all. And you get like a lot of like whataboutery. If you say something is good and something is bad, so people, if you say something is good, people will potentially assume that you're saying it's the best. So again, like, okay, we'll say like, I think avocados are good, and someone will say, oh well, what about grapes? I know it's a bit of a weird example, but I can say that I like avocados without someone some big grape fucking obsessed lunatic having to argue with me about it. Like, saying something is good doesn't mean you're saying that it is the best or the only option. People get really, like, particularly on the internet, you can't say that something is good without someone telling you either why it's bad, like the first point, like, why things that you think are good are also bad, and also that if you say it's good, they also assume you're saying it's the best. So you can't say, oh, I think Tom Cruise is a good actor, because they'll be like, well, what about Jason Statham? It doesn't make any sense. That whataboutery is ridiculous. Saying something is good doesn't mean you're saying it's the best, and it doesn't mean that you're ignoring all of the other options either, but you get it an awful lot of the time. Things like whether something is good or bad, or your perception of whether something is good or bad, can change like on your level of experience. So for example, I think that cream eggs are shit. I fucking hate cream eggs. Not nice to me. Too sickly and sweet. And I know people get really fucking passionate about cream eggs when you say you don't like them. Like, what the fuck? How can you not like cream eggs? They're the nicest thing ever. They are gross. They're too sugary. Chocolate is sugary enough without having to add a load more sugar into the middle of it. Cream eggs are horrible. And they get everywhere. And they're all sticky. Fuck cream eggs, by the way. Might be a whole separate podcast on that as to why cream eggs are shit. Shit, they are. Fuck cream eggs. I got quite passionate about that. But if you say, if I was a caveman, if you were to transport me back in time and I grew up as a caveman, having never had chocolate in my life, or without even knowing what it is, and you fed me a cream egg, and I'd never tried something that sugary in my life before, then I would be going fucking mental for cream eggs, because I haven't experienced anything like it. So your experiences, to date, affect whether you think something is good or bad. And, that's not just, lack of experience of other things. Like, obviously, your taste changed. So, like, I used to think mushrooms were really bad. And now I can't get enough of mushrooms. I cannot get enough of them. And that happens to people all the time. Your tastes change, and, your preferences change. And something that you did consider to be bad, you then consider to be good. You get this with, like, racist opinions. People in the past, or just general discriminatory opinions, people in the past didn't like people who were different to them. I mean, there's a lot of them still around, people like that, but people traditionally always thought that people who were different were bad. So you get a lot of people 10 years ago, 20 years ago, were putting out communications to say that they didn't like people who were different, but now their opinions have changed over the last 20 years. And you get celebrities who are then criticised for stuff they said 20 years ago, but the truth is their perception of what is good and bad has changed over the 20 years. So that isn't even really through lived experiences, that's basically through other people's perception of what is good and bad. So it's now popular to not be a racist. It's now popular to not think that being gay is bad. And as a result of that change in popularity, people change their opinions. So whether something is, so something that was bad 20 years ago is now considered to be good, or at least sort of neutral. So how can you possibly say that something is good and bad? Because the chances are that by the end of your life, you're going to change your opinion on it anyway. Which is nuts. So this concept of good and bad doesn't really exist. or it's at least a very fluid situation. And speaking of like neutrality, so maybe there is no such thing as good and bad. It's all just like a human construct. So it's just something that we've made up to make our lives more interesting or make our lives easier, because we can make decisions as to what is preferable for us and what isn't. And as a result, we can avoid the things that aren't preferable and go with the things that are preferable. And that's why we've created this construct of good and bad. But in truth, like in the context of the universe, even the worst things like cancer and Hitler probably are pretty neutral. And even the best things like Parmesan cheese and taking your socks off after a long day of standing up, even those best things, they're probably quite neutral as well. That the universe is still going to end in the same way, no matter whether someone does something good or bad. The universe is still going to pan out the same way, because really, we have no influence on it. Time is going to move forward regardless of whether something is good or bad. So maybe everything is just neutral. That was, again, the sort of thing that someone says when they've been smoking a lot of weed, and I promise you that I haven't. Well, I have just noticed I'm not wearing my glasses, which, not ideal for the podcast. I like to wear my glasses. I think it makes it look better and more studious. So if you're watching on YouTube, I'm sorry for not looking better or studious. If you're listening, then I'm sure this won't really affect your experience as to whether I'm wearing glasses or not. But, anyway, let's move on. That was a bit of a weird tangent. And you get things like better versus worse. So, like, is something better than something else? Rather than saying something is good and something else is bad, you might say that something is better than something else, which I know like ties into whataboutery a little bit. But that's always subjective, isn't it, really? Like, you might say that taller people are better than shorter people, but that's really a subjective opinion. Or, I make a better souffle than you. It's a subjective opinion, unless it can be like numerically quantified. But even that depends on detail. So unless you can actually like prove it with numbers, the chances are that the better versus worse debate is subjective. So the example I've got here is the album Back to Bedlam better than the album from Grease, the film? I mean, I would say that Back to Bedlam it is probably the best album ever written, even though it was an inside job orchestrated by James Blunt and the rap industry. It's a previous podcast episode. Listen to it. You'll be entertained. But yeah, is Back to Bedlam better than Grease? Well, Back to Bedlam has sold 3.6 million albums in the UK. Grease has only sold 2.6. So numerically, you would say that Back to Bedlam is better than Grease, which it is, obviously. But numerically, you can prove that. But then it depends on detail, because what a person who disagrees with that might say, what a person who prefers Grease might say, is that people are idiots, and the fact that more people bought it doesn't mean it's better. But you can't numerically quantify that, so it makes it subjective. Or it's about detail, so it's about like Back to Bedlam probably had a more solid marketing campaign than Grease did, because of more modern technology, more modern media, better circulation through TV. So you can't say whether Back to Bedlam is better than Grease, even though there are numbers to back it up, which is nuts, really. So look, that was a pretty crazy rant. There's a lot of edits in there because this has been a pretty stumbly podcast. A lot to digest. And it's one of those podcasts when you're comparing something like good versus bad, you end up saying the words good versus bad so often that it sort of gets into your head a little bit. So look, the conclusion really is that when you're saying something is good or bad, that the answer is that it depends. And I know that is pretty fucking obvious and everyone knows that, but actually they don't. If you go online and you just have a read through some comments online, the cesspit of online comments sections, you can see that people don't accept that their view might be misinformed, or that they might change their view, or that they might have a different perspective from somebody else. Although what they're talking about isn't relevant, or comparing stuff where they shouldn't be. Yeah, like whataboutery, there's no need for that either. So you think that this whole good, bad, being subjective thing, it's obvious, but clearly it's not. People don't seem to be able to accept that if someone tells them that the thing they're saying the best isn't the best, that they automatically think it's the worst. That this happens every single day. And all of us are guilty of it. I think everyone is guilty of getting caught up in whether things are good or bad, rather than just accepting that other people probably have different opinions on that, and that their opinion is subjective. So that was pretty much my rant on it. That's all I got to say. Look, thanks for listening. Thanks for getting to this point. Follow the podcast on social media, just the podcast name. Tell a friend. I like the whole tell a friend thing. I've had a couple of people recently tell me that they've told their friends about the podcast, which I'm always like, yes, come on when that happens. So I do appreciate it if you have done that. And just keep tuning in. Likes and subscribes and 5 stars and thumbs up and all that jazz. That's all appreciated. Look, I'll be back next week. Probably move away from the deep philosophical arguments about whether or not human concepts exist next week, because that's been a pretty exhausting cut of episodes. In fact, I might try and make next week as silly as I possibly can, but we shall see, and I will see you then. Thank you very much, and bye.